entitled John Barleycorn. Please welcome Reuben Welsh.
Inspiring, bold John Barleycorn, what dangers thou canst make us scorn. Those words were said by Rabbi Burns, our national bard. He unfortunately died in 1796, 212 years ago. But even 1,000 years before he died, people were making Scotch whisky. Not quite by the same method all the time, because technology has improved, but by pretty much the same process. And it's the process of making malt whisky that I'd like to talk to you about this evening. Malt whisky is made from but 3 natural ingredients, that you can all see: yeast, water and barley. You also get grain whisky, which is made from just plain corn or barley. But I'm particularly talking about malt whisky, which is made from malted barley. What is malt, you might ask? Malt is a natural process where the grain, the barley, is steeped in water for a couple of days, spread out on a floor like this malting floor here, and allowed to sprout. And the reason that happens is because in sprouting, the barley turns the starch, which it's pretty much entirely made of, into sugar. And that sugar can then be fermented into alcohol. So there you've got some soggy malted barley, just growing away. After a few days, it's dried out in a malting kiln. Can't speak to the whiskey. Traditionally, these were peat-fired, and the heat from the peat fires not only drew out moisture of the malt, but it also imparted a smoky flavour. And some of the peatiest, smokiest ones come from the Isle of Islay on the west coast of Scotland, amongst which comes Lefroy, Ardbeg, which is the distillery chimneys, and Lagavulin. So once it's dried out, your malt is ground up to make it like a rough flour. That's called grist. And it's added to hot water, and the hot water draws out the sugars that's been caused by the malting. This is done 3 times in a thing called a mash tun. Stirred up for a period of time, all the sugar is drawn out. Any starch from the barley that's left behind is attacked by the enzymes in the barley and turned into more sugar, which eventually makes more alcohol. The sort of mash that's left at the end is usually turned into animal feed, or certainly was traditionally. The sugary solution, or wort, that comes out, known as wort, goes into these big tanks, which can take up to 10,000 litres, some of them. And basically they're just big fermenting tanks. Stuff goes in, throw in some yeast, it's probably a bit more high-tech than that, chuck some yeast in, it all ferments away, like you're making beer or bread. The CO2 comes up and out. If you're making bread, that's what would make the bread rise. That's not what we're after here, we're after the alcohol solution that's left, and that's almost a rudimentary beer that's in those tanks. It's not called beer, it's called wash. And this wash goes into the pot stills. Now these are quite a famous sight throughout Scotland. This is the Glenfiddich one, I believe. Are big copper kettles. They look very complicated. They all vary in shape, and that has an effect on the distilling. Generally, they are just big kettles, and a simplified schematic of them, which I hastily drew up, they look like a kettle. The heat goes into the bottom, it warms the wash up. The wash evaporates at different temperatures. The alcohol comes out at about 70-80 degrees Celsius. The water, as you get closer to normal boiling point, comes up the chimney and down into a condenser, which you can probably see in the background with big cylindrical things. That cools it down, and it then goes into a secondary pot still. The stages you can read for yourselves at the bottom go from the wash at 5% to a low wine. The safe part of that is taken out. There are some dangerous things like methanol sometimes in it, which do get discarded. And it eventually becomes what's known as a new make spirit, which is about usually 60 to 70% alcohol. About 2 parts alcohol to 1 part water. That then is a rough whisky. Legally, to be called Scotch whisky, it has to be matured in an oak barrel for a minimum of 3 years. This is one of the more attractive bonded warehouses that you see scattered around Scotland. It's actually just down the road in Gorgie. It used to be a bonded warehouse. The reason for that is obviously whiskey is very valuable, and people will steal it or drink it, or set fire to it. More attractive inside are the oak barrels. Oh, wrong slide. There are thousands and thousands of these oak barrels inside, and the reason that they use oak is that the oak does two things. One, that the flavour of the oak is imparted into the neat spirit, or the strong spirit. But also a secondary reason is that the oak barrels are all second-hand and have all had previous other sorts of spirits in them, so the flavours come out and impart both their aroma and the colour into the whiskey, which would otherwise be pretty sort of insipid looking, just look like water. That process, as you can read, can take between 3 and 20 or even 30 years, which is why there are thousands of barrels just sitting there. And in the time it takes these porous barrels to sit there, quite a large percentage of the spirit inside it evaporates through the wood. And this is known as the angel's share because it disappears. It gives the angels just hanging around something to do for 30 years. But at the same time, in the coastal area, salt air can also go in and give a sort of salty taste, or a coastal taste to the whiskey. Once you've got it in a bottle, which can be done locally to the distillery, you'll see perhaps something such as Islay single malt. That means it's come from a single distillery, Lefroy. If it came from a couple of distilleries, Lagavulin, also on Islay, for example, it would be known as a vatted, blended or pure malt, still a malt whisky. And if it had had the grain whisky that I mentioned previously, which is kind of an inferior kind of quickly made whisky, added to it, it's known as a blended whisky. And that's why blended whisky is generally quite a lot cheaper than single malt whisky. So they've been making it for 1,000 years. The technology is a bit better now than 1,000 years ago, I'm sure, but the process is still the same. 3 natural ingredients: yeast, water, malted barley. It's malted and dried in the drying rooms, ground up and mashed in the mash tuns, fermented in the washbacks, which I didn't actually mention by name earlier. It's distilled at least twice in the pot stills, the big copper kettles, casked and matured for at least 3 and sometimes up to 30 years, bottled. What I haven't added is taxed heavily by Alistair Darling, and then we get to drink it at Toastmaster meetings. And the reason I say that is because I only have a sip of that, and I don't actually drink whiskey very often, so I have some samples during the break, and I'd like to drink most of this if possible between us. So if you're interested, there are 40 empty glasses out there. I'm afraid they're plastic, and we'll be having some in the break. But please, drink responsibly. You don't want to end up like this. I wasn't going to bring a picture of me in. So moving swiftly on, drink your whiskey responsibly.